Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Welcome to episode 4 of the EconTalk book club on Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Our guide, again, is Dan Klein. Dan, thanks for being part of this book club experience.
My pleasure.
And our topic for today are parts 3, 4, and 5. You can find online versions of the book, audio versions of the book, other resources at econtalk.org/bookclub.html, and along with previous episodes, of course. And we'll be doing one more episode after this on the last part of the book, parts 6 and 7. I want to say as an introduction that the first 2 parts of the book that we talked about in episodes 2 and 3, I found a little bit slow. And a little bit dry. I enjoyed them, but it was hard going, especially the reading. The conversation I enjoyed a great deal, Dan, but the reading was a bit slow. This part is totally different for me. I found parts 3 and 4 and 5 to be utterly fascinating. The writing style is dramatically livelier. It's funnier. It's more eloquent. It's deeper. It's more profound. And I found myself thinking a great deal about the ideas. And for those of you who perhaps have been listening without reading or just enjoying the podcasts, reading part 3 by itself would be a profitable activity for your brain and soul. And although, of course, I recommend parts 1 and 2 as well. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Dan. He's going to start us off with some observations about the impartial spectator, and which runs through this section a great deal. These sections.
So before we turn to just the start of part 3 and work our way through, I thought I would say a little bit about some of the general things that are going on here. Smith's general approach or principle that he's using throughout the book, what might be called an organon, I think the word is organon. Organon is the word. I'm sorry. It took me.
Don't know what that word
organon.
is.
Like actually in microeconomic theory, we have an organon of utility maximization. It's sort of like a principle that we just use. We kind of see the world this way, through this lens. I'm not saying actually that's necessarily a good organon, but that's what the word means. It means it's a principle applied in inquiry, perhaps scientific or scholarly inquiry, almost as a matter of method, as like a convention, the way we approach it.
It's a Weltanschauung.
I guess so, yeah, it is.
Just to pick a word, a foreign language word that...
So what is Smith's organon?
Which means a worldview, sorry.
What is Smith's organon? We've already alluded to it. It's that moral judgment is always enshrouded in some kind of sympathy, some kind of spectatorial sympathy. That is the organon of Smith in this book. That's sort of the principle he insists on and follows through with. Moral judgment is always enshrouded in some kind of spectatorial sympathy. Okay? And wherever necessary, he will make that work, even if it means kind of inventing the spectator with whom you're sympathizing to kind of provide that enshrouding of a moral judgment. And he is very consistent with this. I just wanted to highlight a couple of passages. And, you know, I find this a very provocative idea. And the more I think about it, the more I think there might be something to it, something deep to it, the idea that it's going on subconsciously, instinctually. It's something that maybe we internalize when we're infants with our parents telling good, bad, you know, and everything else before we even know what those words mean. Just the tones of their voices and so on. And it's very deep in our heads. And I believe that psychological research is finding more and more in line with this.
Can I just add something to that?
Sure.
It's not just in my reading of the book, it's not just the spectatorial view that motivates or explains or creates morality. It's also happiness and our pride, self-esteem, self-worth, feelings of attractiveness, beauty, a whole range of things comes from what people think of us. And that's a very disturbing view in many ways, I think, when you think about it a lot. And I think that's why I agree with you. It's a very deep idea. The idea that I think most of us like the idea that we just live by our principles. I don't care what other people think. I do what's right, or I'm going to be myself. I'm not going to be swayed by other people's perceptions of me. And that as you call it, organon, that worldview, that framework is really profound. It makes it very difficult if you're aware of it. And one of the reasons I found reading this book so affecting is that as you start to read it and you start thinking of yourself as being observed by those spectators, be they friends or strangers, partial or impartial, it's not a comfortable place to be. I don't like the idea. I don't think most people like the idea that we would respond to those essentially incentives of how people view us. We like to think, I'm my own man, I'm my own person. As I said, the idea that I'm going to be myself. But if we view ourselves as others see us, suddenly we're not just ourselves anymore, and that is a little bit jarring, a little bit strange. And most of the time we don't think about it.
Yeah.
We don't think about it consciously. But what Smith's saying is we think about it unconsciously all the time.
Right.
And it's a very provocative view.
Yeah, he does, though, allow for independence, right? He does. Absolutely, he does. But he allows for independence of those external, actual spectators, right? But it's an independence founded on a dependence of a kind of internal spectator, right? Which itself is sort of derived from society.
Correct, and that's the complexity of this. There's we talked earlier about the layers of the onion. There's a simultaneity, a bouncing back and forth constantly in the first part of part 3 for me of the man within, meaning the way I view myself, the man without, the way I view others viewing me. But that in turn starts to affect the man within. I mean, it's a very complicated system.
I just wanted to share a couple of passages on this organon thing. He says, this is on page 165, what is agreeable to our moral faculties is fit and right and proper to be done. Okay, so what's fit and right and proper to be done is what is agreeable or sympathetic or sympathized with by these moral faculties. He's like defining rightness as the spectatorial sympathy with such a moral faculty, which he's in the context is like a spectatorial being. Elsewhere he writes, all such sentiments suppose the idea of some other being who is the natural judge of the person that feels them, and that is only by sympathy with the decisions of this arbiter of his conduct, in other words, my sympathy with the arbiter of my conduct, that I'll say I can conceive either the triumph of self-applause or the shame of self-condemnation. So even for internal self-condemnation or self-applause, it is enshrouded, I think it's a good word to use, perhaps, enshrouded in this sense of sympathy with something, right? And that's like his always going back to.
And although most of the book is dealing with morality, he every once in a while has explicit chapters on it, on aesthetics, on beauty, physical beauty, artistic beauty, literary beauty. And I'm inevitably drawn to the idea of the reader over your shoulder. As a writer, I always have an implicit reader over my shoulder. Sometimes it's my wife, who could literally be over my shoulder, but often it's a friend or a kind of reader that I have in mind reading this and reacting to the words. And again, I think, to come back to my point about the discomfort, we tend to look down on writers who write to be popular, who write to find lots of impartial spectators, whereas the writer who's obscure and innovative and nobody likes, but he's an artist because he goes his own way. Smith, he's not judging that, I don't think, but it forces you to think about that tension in writing for your audience versus writing for yourself. A person who writes just for himself, who's not a very sympathetic person, is going to have a lonely life. But a person who writes for himself, who happens to write for others as well, is going to be very successful.
Yeah. It's totally a tension of deciding what your implied audience is going to be.
And you could argue, and Smith kind of, I think, ducks this issue most of the time. You could argue that Smith's really talking, because of his focus on on propriety, that it's a moral relativism, right? Because it's not, there are very few, but let me say it differently. I think Smith, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Smith has absolutes of what is the good, but he sort of assumes everybody shares those, at least in British society, so that what others think of you fitting in is sufficient. But of course, in a brutal society, fitting in means being brutal. So it's this focus on the spectator, in a way, is a justification for the norms of society, good or bad, being in harmony, which is one of his themes. Mm-hmm. But I think actually he's a little stronger than that. I think he actually does believe that the norms of his society, at least, were good, were just, not just fit.
Yeah, those are big themes. I think I'm reluctant to jump into that.
Okay.
We'll try to do all that. But,
okay.
Because the relativism versus universalism, the idea, just to kind of reiterate your points there, the relativism versus a kind of universalism, and the idea of whether or not society tends towards moral progress and improvement. And is he just talking about Britain and so on? What is he assuming are the settings if you have such a kind of invisible hand in morals going? If you're asserting a kind of invisible hand in morals, what setting are you assuming for that? Yeah. Just on the whole spectatorial thing in the Organon, I just wanted to also point out that he says that men view what happens in the world also in terms of intelligent beings, okay? And this, I guess, he kind of thinking of the origins of religion. He says, this opinion or apprehension, I say, seems to be impressed by nature. Men are naturally led to ascribe to those mysterious beings, whatever they are, which happen in any country, to be the objects of religious fear, all their own sentiments and passions. They have no other, they can conceive no other to ascribe to them. Those unknown intelligences which they imagine but see not must necessarily be formed with some sort of resemblance to those intelligences of which they have experience, namely people. Yeah. And so they personify, God, and then, so many of these moral judgments are hooked up with God, and then that's the enshrouding, right?
When I read that passage, I wrote in the margin, man creates God in his own image, right? Yeah. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, God creates man in God's image. In this story, which is a primitive story, because he's talking about gods, plural, he's talking, I think, about sort of primitive cultures. He's saying, when you inevitably create God in man's image, which it's a beautiful sociology of religion argument, utterly fascinating.
And Smith doesn't say this other thing, but just again, I want to hit it. The idea that when we're infants, people are saying more and more now that like the first 5 years are like highly determinative to people. And the idea that we are like deeply subconsciously internalizing sort of moral notions about right and wrong, and then we perhaps like work with those like in a subconscious way onward, would be very congruent with Smith's Organon. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. So let me now just kind of spit out my take on the impartial spectator. I'll be real interested to see a reaction to it. And this is, again, all before we start going page by page. So the impartial spectator, as I see it, the impartial spectator in Smith actually ultimately is a almost universal being emanating a kind of universalist wisdom. That is, my impartial spectator is not different than your impartial spectator. My man in the breast is my man in the breast, and it's different from your man in the breast, okay? And in each, respectively, our man in the breast is the supposed impartial spectator, the representative of the impartial spectator, and so on. But we have, we have our own imperfect internal representatives of this impartial spectator. And what I see is going on in Smith, he says, I divide myself, as it were, into two persons, right? This is when he's talking about he divides himself into the judge and the one judged of.
Yeah.
But the thing is, of course, that, each of those persons can be divided into two persons.
That's right.
The judge that you just created can be divided into two persons. One being the one who judged the first judged of, and the second being the one who judges the judge of the first judged of. Right?
I lost you there, Dan. I got to try that again.
Okay, so let's say I turn my music up loud. Maybe it's disturbing my neighbor. I'm not sure. I divide myself into two persons. The person who turned up the volume.
Who's enjoying it.
Yeah. And now the judge who judges the me who just turned up the volume. And that judge then thinks about it. But then that judge can be divided into two persons. It's like, am I judging this right? And so you can also then create a judge of the judge. Okay.
Which inevitably is coming from me from you, because there's no one else in your head. It's
right.
Your created judge of the judge.
Yes. Yes, and as things get routinized, okay, and your judgments, you can always sort of step back and judge again, right? And judge deeper. And you should always be awake to the next level of judging. That's the onion, right?
Yeah, and he talks about self-deception, that it's...
That's right.
It's all well and good to say the impartial spectator has judged me to be just and moral.
Or the internal, the supposed.
Maybe I'm fooling myself about maybe he's not so impartial because he's mine.
That's exactly.
And maybe I cooked him up to be sympathetic to my self-interest.
Exactly. And so I think Smith has this totally dialectical view. It's a rather optimistic view about the process, which I think kind of suggests a continuing approach towards the absolute, the universal impartial spectator, because it's always calling, and there are dynamics in society by people's reactions and so on. I don't necessarily believe this today. I think the world today is very different, quite different than the world he spoke of. And if we want to go down that highly political road, we can. But
it's not just political; it's cultural too.
Well, of course, the political culture. It's the political culture. I mean, it's
the regular culture about what's considered good behavior and what's considered decent, over the top, what's considered gentlemanly, which is totally different than what was considered.
I'm not so sure, though, that as far as upsetting invisible hand mechanisms in morals, I mean, I guess this is just my organon is to blame it on government.
It could be.
Right?
Could be.
That's my scientific organon.
Yeah,
it's the government's fault. And I'm not so sure that the things you're referring. I'm not so sure I'm with you on that. But politically, there's stuff going on because government in a politicized society is now such a big player in the culture in so many ways that in many respects I'm concerned that Smith's optimistic view about sort of invisible hand mechanisms having the upper hand may not be true. But anyway, so the impartial spectator, I think in Smith, is ultimately almost like a sun, a single sun around which we all orbit. And each of us as a being kind of continually creates these layered judges, or if you like, increasingly refined judge. Right, where you got the judge of the judge, and then they kind of sort things out and get reconciled, and then become sort of judge sub T this period, or you definitely need subscripts for Smith. That's the thing. It's definitely like a sequence, and this idea of a universalist impartial spectator might enters the whole question of relativism. The thing is, what this universal impartial spectator thinks is right and wrong, proper and improper, and so on, is very much going to depend on context. Well, if the tradition is this and the context is this, the constraints are this, the scarcities are such, sure, maybe that is proper. Maybe infanticide, he brings up infanticide, right? And he condemns it strongly. But he does have a line in there about, well, in these circumstances, when someone's fleeing and they know that if they try to save their baby as well, neither of them are going to be saved, it's pardonable. So in that, the universalism doesn't mean some kind of simple, draconian,
black and white,
one size fits all. It's kind of like, this constantly, developed and explored thing.
Well, so we talked about it in the first podcast. It's loose, vague, and indeterminate. A lot of what's fit, proper, and just is got to be looked at carefully, which of course opens the door to self-deception since it's not black and white, and that's right. I think the great challenge of moral behavior.
Yeah. So that, I think, in a nutshell, is what I make of the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator, by the way, seems to be a he, whereas the author of Nature or Nature is a she. I don't know if you noticed that.
Well, there's very little sex-based differences in this book. He lived, I assume, mainly in a world of men. So I think most of what he was talking about in society was male. There's a few references to female sensibilities, but a lot of it is male-oriented. Mm-hmm. Whether he thought that included women, in his day, that style of writing could have, but I would assume that a lot of his observations about the people he's talking about are men. The one thought I had about that, I don't have anything to add to that, Dan, except to notice that one thing that struck me in a couple of places was the intellectual hubris that Smith has in talking about how we feel. He's the ultimate armchair theorizer here, I assume. He's not doing a lot of field research on how people feel about being judged or what motivated them in a moral crisis or a dilemma. He lays it down as if he's getting it from Sinai, that these are the laws of human nature, the laws of morality. He's totally unhesitant in saying how people respond to different moral and emotional and economic situations. He never says, it seems to me, or in my experience, or I've noticed. It's all men react. It's just he's very self-confident. So hubris may be a little strong, but I would if I'd been his buddy and I'd seen this draft and he asked me for feedback, I would have said, how do you know? But he keeps going forward, and it rings true for me, but most of the time. But I found it interesting that he, partly maybe because of his self-confidence or partly because of the time he was in, he's speculating tremendously about the brain as if he's in other people's brains. But he's only got one brain to refer to, and it's Adam Smith's of 1759 through whenever. And it's fascinating to me that he did it with such confidence.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I don't know. I guess maybe we allow great authors a lot of leeway to just kind of blurt it out there, make their case, make their illustrations stark. Very often, he does have some very, like when he says that the beggar sunning himself by the side of the road enjoys the tranquility that rich guys are struggling for. It's like, oh, is that so?
Yeah, right. How does he? Yeah, maybe not.
Right. Let's ask a beggar.
Yeah,
if he's enjoying the tranquility. That rich men are struggling for.
It doesn't seem that way at the stoplights when the cardboard sign, but maybe we're missing something.
But I guess the thing to do is to start kind of like rolling through this. There's so much here, and we are certainly short on time, so I think it's going to have to be more sketchy. So part 3 is of the foundation of our judgments concerning our own sentiments and conduct and the sense of duty. So whereas the first 2 parts were about judging others, he's now turning it inward, and he's saying it's by the same kind of means.
He's using those results.
Yeah, that's right. He's using those results to look inward now, and we are asking ourselves, what a spectator would think of our conduct. First of all, we key off what people actually seem to be reacting to our conduct, and he speaks of them as mirrors for us. But we also start judging of ourselves, and this is where he says, I divide myself, as it were, into two persons, the judge and the judged of. And he shortly starts going into how we are implanted with a desire not only to be praised, but to be praiseworthy.
Yeah, to me, that summed up his whole view of the human enterprise, right?
Yeah.
We want to be loved, but we want to merit being loved, both because he hates deception, the idea that we might do something that people think is great, but also we want to do the right thing is his claim, which is really shocking.
Yep. He says, the love of praiseworthiness is by no means derived altogether from the love of praise.
Right.
So he's against someone who wants to reduce it all to praise. One of his proofs of this is that when you get praised for something you don't deserve praise for, you don't feel good about it. It doesn't feel as, it doesn't feel as good as the praise you actually deserved. So he's got this introspective proof of that. And in fact, many people will say, hey, even when no one else could have found out, hey, I didn't actually do this, or I didn't do it on purpose, or what have you. And
he critiques women who wear makeup because he says, hey, it's fake. They're not really beautiful. They're just made up. He probably wouldn't be a big fan of plastic surgery. It's a strange view of makeup, but in his day, that was the equivalent, I guess, that was the most a person could do to look more beautiful than they really were.
That's right. He was saying that wearing
vanity.
makeup...
He calls it vanity, which is clearly not a good thing.
It might be getting people admiration for their beauty they didn't deserve, was apparently his take on that. Yeah. He says we do enjoy external praise. One reason is that it provides confirmation of our own sense of praiseworthiness. There's a lot in this about the unknowability of the self, or the incomplete knowledge of oneself. There's a lot about people don't know what they're capable of. They don't know if they've really done good. They don't know themselves. So in Smith, there's a lot of unknowability. It's not only the unknowability of the economy, like in the Wealth of Nations, but there's actually an unknowability of the self. And there's even an unknowability, really, of the good, right? That goes back to the loose, vague, and indeterminate. Like, what is it that the self, let's suppose the self is pursuing the good, we're not even sure what the good is, right? So there's a lot of unknowability that is ineradicable in Smith. That's part of the mystery of Smith, in my view. So he's got a few proofs, an extensive discussion of our value for praiseworthiness and our desire to not be blameworthy. Let's see, I've got something underlined here. He applauds and admires himself by sympathies which do not... Oh, this is when the world accuses us, say, of something which we didn't actually do wrong, but they think we did wrong, and we can't maybe convince them. And in cases such as this, we get we compensate ourselves with considerable comfort by resorting to the internal spark, the spectator. He says, the man so accused applauds and admires himself by sympathies which do not indeed actually take place, but which the ignorance of the public alone hinders from taking place. But those sympathies do happen, as it were, with his imaginary spectator.
He's got that incredible passage where he says... a person will sacrifice his life in battle. I think it's talking about battle. And he's imagining the applause he's going to get after his death.
That's right.
Even though he's not going to hear it, he's going to enjoy it now.
Exactly.
It's an incredible claim.
Another proof that it's not praise. The guy won't be alive to get the praise.
Yeah.
He also uses the expression, if the world was ever made to understand properly the real circumstances of our behavior. Again, the knowledge problem in Smith, that... we can't know just everyone's moral worth, what everyone's absolutely morally do.
And they can't know ours.
And they can't know ours.
So our circumstances could be such that we're actually doing an extraordinary thing.
That's right.
But since they can't know us perfectly, we have to live with that and find comfort in the fact that we know we did the right thing.
That's right. We have to create a judge who does know. The only judge who can know.
Which can be God, and he occasionally is going to invoke that as the one who solves the knowledge problem to some extent, right? Because God knows
That's right.
in his world, knows our motives, knows our actions in a way that our friends and spectators can't.
The impartial spectator is God is an obvious, translation.
But it's not most of the time. Most of the time...
In Smith.
In Smith,
Oh, yeah. No, it's not that he insists on that. But, anyone who wanted to see it that way could easily and systematically, I think, see it that way. Okay, man falsely accused of crime is humbled that anyone should think so mean of his character, that he be capable of it. And that's one of the reasons you can't kind of fully compensate internally for what's happening to you externally. And then Smith goes on to say that this is actually the wisdom of nature, because we want to make people vigilant not to do things wrong. Because if they could fully, if they could sort of fully compensate themselves, they wouldn't take all that extra care to make sure that nothing bad happens that they would get the external blame for.
All these things are examples to me of 19th century British literature. The person who's harboring a terrible secret of or not just British literature, world literature. It's the person who harbors the secret act that they did that no one knows about, whether it's good or bad. Mm-hmm. That tension is what creates a lot of the world's art.
That's right.
Because it's unbearable for us. We want the world to know about the good deed or the bad deed. We want it to be rewarded or punished in its full measure. And Smith talks a lot about that frustration that we have and the urge we have to compensate and punish based on the reality of the motives, especially, and the acts, and how it's imperfect. It's not going to be that way, and that bugs us. And so you think about the world's, the great novels and operas. What? Crime. I'm thinking of Crime and Punishment. I'm thinking of a lot of Dickens. I wonder how much Smith, if any, Dickens read, but a lot of his characters go through this anguish. Sidney Carton in...
we've got this theme in here that over time you come more and more to the view of the impartial spectator, like the man who loses his leg. At first, he's, really upset, and, even after the pain passes, he's maybe, complaining a lot and feels it's unfair and, whining a lot about it. But eventually, he kind of comes to the view that an impartial spectator is it's a shame, but, life goes on. There's no point in whining. Get on with life and just, don't expect other people to treat it special or whatever. And over time, the guy gets back to normal, as it were. Just like we were saying before about the lottery winner goes back to normal and the quadriplegic tends to go back. So there's this tendency to towards an impartial spectator. So if Raskolnikov, right, kills the woman and wants to kind of progress towards any kind of moral advance, he's got to, at least in Dostoevsky, I suppose, and in Smith, he's got to kind of come to grips with the fact that this horrible thing he's done.
That the world is going to judge him. The world has judged him. They just don't know about it, right? That he's got to internalize. It's such a
maybe the universe has judged him,
or God, but it's such a remarkable. I didn't think enough about the loss of the leg. The idea that this poor person who's lost his leg is going to be ultimately reconciled by putting himself in the shoes of the sympathetic but not too sympathetic impartial spectator who can't feel his loss ever, right? A person with both legs can't really know what it's like to have lost a leg. Can sympathize, but that person's got his own life, and that the person who has lost the leg is going to come to cope with it by putting himself in the shoes of the less than perfectly sympathetic spectator who's only impartial. It is really a tremendously provocative idea. It's really deep. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating.
All this discussion reminds me, though, of the Woody Allen film Crimes and Misdemeanors, where Martin Landau has, his mistress iced by Jerry Orbach. And at the end of the movie, what happens is that he's perfectly content and he goes on living and nothing happens.
That's Woody Allen's moral universe. It's sort of devoid of justice. It's a theme that runs through many of his quote serious movies. It's in Match Point's got a similar conclusion.
I don't recall exactly how that wound up, but
yeah, it does. Trust me.
But it's not. Empirically, it's not clear that there aren't people like the character in of Martin Landau in the movie, or do you dispute that?
I don't know. It's a deep question. I don't think it's. I I don't think it's answered easily outside of context circumstances and constraints, the things you talked about earlier. I think the potential for self-deception by the Raskolnikovs of the world is probably immense.
By the Woody Allens of the world.
Yeah, that you can go on with your life, and I think a lot about whether someone like O.J. Simpson, who is some of the world has decided he's a murderer, some of the world's decided he's not, but I wonder what he thinks about himself if he actually did do the crime. I could imagine. I mean, the power for self-deception is so large. I can imagine he's probably decided he wasn't, even if he was guilty, he's innocent. Our ability, because we do want to go on with our life. So I'm not sure everybody has the torment of Raskolnikov or the ease of Martin Landau. I don't think it's obviously not as simple as that. It's not like, which one is it? I think different people have different regret, remorse, and ability to put it behind them, or an ability to force themselves to come to grips with it. And I think it's probably different for different people.
Smith certainly affirms the sort of remorse view, right? Is Smith's very different than the Woody Allen movie.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, that may be his time.
Yeah, and it could also be his agenda, as it were.
Or his class, yeah.
What's that?
Or his class. It's not just his time. It's he comes from a certain he's in a certain circle of people that may have very much been true of.
I think he might be exhorting, though.
Oh, I like that idea.
It's a worthy thing for society to aspire to. Exactly. Yeah. I think there's so much of that in Smith. Anyhow. He notes that we are more anxious to know about praise or blame when we are uncertain of our own propriety, because we're more eager to get that feedback. Again, highlighting that we don't even know ourselves necessarily that well, even though we're sort of witnesses to our action. He's got the thing about the poets versus the mathematicians, which I know you like, Russ. You mentioned it in the hallway.
It's so good.
Where mathematicians know darn well, the merit of their work and the merit of each other's work. I mean, this is the way Smith tells it. I'm not sure if you visit the math department, it'll look this way, but the way Smith tells it is they know so darn well the merit of their own work, of their colleagues' work, and in relation to each other, that there's very little acrimony between them. They get along fine as a bunch of people who sort of pursue their, inquiries, getting the recognition they pretty much all feel and see each other deserves. Poets, on the other hand,
loose, vague, and indeterminate.
Totally
Who's
loose,
a good poet?
Exactly, totally loose, vague, and indeterminate. And so they all have very different feelings about the standing and respect they each distinction that they each deserve, and they create cabals,
cliques, factions.
Exactly. Which Smith does a great job of sort of ridiculing and making fun of. Interestingly, he speaks of natural philosophers, that would be like physics and stuff, like the mathematician. He doesn't say anything about moral philosophers here. Yeah,
or political economists. It kind of goes back to our previous podcast before the book club about groupthink. In economics, who's a good economist is loose, vague, and indeterminate. So to some extent, our professions relied on mathematical ability as a measure of
that's a good point. That's exactly right.
Of who's the best economist. And those of us who are not great mathematicians or who have a different value system, whether we're self-deceiving or not, are using a different metric. But as a result, it's loose, vague, and indeterminate. And so you get factions in economics about who's good and who isn't. And two thoughts, though. One, I suspect there's a mathematician listening to this, and I'd ask him to let us know whether Smith's right about mathematics. But I was struck about the disputes between Newton and Leibniz over the founding of calculus, the discovery of calculus. They may all agree as to what is great mathematics, that Leibniz was a great mathematician and Newton was, but there certainly was a tremendous amount of backstabbing and aggressive claims on who found it first. I think by Newton, because he wanted that acclaim. So I don't think he was as serene as Smith. In Smith's view, he's sitting back in his chair. He knows he's a great mathematician. Everybody knows he's a great mathematician. Right. And so, there's no problems. Life is good. But Newton, I don't think he acted that way, it turns out. But,
that could be an example of what you were saying. He doesn't really know about those.
I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah, he may didn't hang out with, but he clearly had, I think, some mathematician friends.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right. And he may have been going off that. He did. Yeah. He certainly did. And in talking about the poets, he totally names names with the cabals and so on.
I kept thinking about the New York Times book review section where, people are patting the backs of their buddies in the reviews of their poetry or fiction and slicing up their enemies.
Mm-hmm. So Smith speaks of the all-wise author of nature has in this manner taught man to respect the sentiments and judgments of his brethren, to be more or less pleased when they approve of his conduct, and to be more or less hurt when they disapprove of it. He has made man, if I may say so, the immediate judge of mankind, and has, in this respect, as in many others, created him after his own image. Which suggests, by the way, then that the author of nature is male.
Yeah.
So that contradicts the what I thought I had figured out, which was that was always female. Anyway, and the author of nature appointed him, man, his vicegerent or vice. How do you say it?
Vicegerent.
Vicegerent, which is some kind of deputy.
Yeah.
Upon earth to superintend the behavior of his brethrens, and so this notion of a sort of bottom down at the bottom, a diffuse, decentralized policing, governing of each other's. We watch each other as equals, right?
Coming back to your point, from the earlier podcast,
it is very strong here, and it's very strong elsewhere in these pages. That we have been sort of deputized to police each other, essentially morally.
I wrote in the margins, there's a divine plan of self-regulation that because we desire the respect of others, we're motivated to behave well. And it implies, of course, that we should judge others to motivate them in turn.
Yep. But I think here he says that sometimes our peers sort of mistake our situation.
Inevitably.
And again, we've kind of touched on this already, but an appeal lies from his sentence to a much higher tribunal, to the tribunal of their own consciences. This is a person sort of falsely accused. To that of the supposed impartial and well-informed spectator, to that of the man within the breast, the great judge and arbiter of their conduct. So this is, I think, really the first time that he fully kind of says, you've got this man in your breast. This man in your breast is a supposed impartial and well-informed spectator. It's not necessarily really impartial or well-informed. And
he's going to concede that later.
Yep. And it's the man in the breast, apparently, who is the great judge and arbiter of one's conduct. So we're not directly judged. We're never directly judged by, God, as it were, by the impartial spectator, by the absolute source or emanator of all of this. It's always just the one that's by us, that we've kind of created outward from our being towards that. Okay, so we're all kind of trying to go towards this great sun, is kind of how I see it. Like one great sun emanating a universalist wisdom, but each of us is this onion type of thing, more of a spiral. Some people objected about the onion not being a spiral. I don't know if you saw that on the comments.
I did see it, yeah.
Hey, an onion they don't serve onion spirals at restaurants. That's a good point. But anyway, so the external tribunal, that is of real people, is founded upon the desire for actual praise, that is praise among actual people. The internal tribunal is founded upon the desire for praiseworthiness. Yeah. That's praise from internal judges. He says, man is sometimes astonished and confounded by the external vehemence and clamor of those without. And this sometimes stupefies us and puts us in check even when we thought we were real justified. I think this is a very interesting thing. I think Smith here, he's got this kind of protagonist who's wrongly judged. He doesn't consider the possibility that his protagonist is completely in error here. I guess he does later in the self-deception. Yeah. But he doesn't here. Did you have any thoughts on that?
No, just that I found it utterly fascinating and beautifully written the way he lays that out in chapter 2 of part 3. It's It really describes, again, the human enterprise of we go through life. We want people to respect us, and we want to respect ourselves, and that those two things interact with each other, the man within and the man without. The way we view ourselves, the way we view the way others view us. And once you start thinking about that, as I said in the introductory comments we had, it starts to ripple through a lot of your conduct and thoughts about what you're doing and why you're doing it. It's very thought-provoking.
Thinking about virtues is actually virtuous.
Yeah, no.
I find I feel like I'm actually a better person. I hope it sticks.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I found that,
it's like instead of Prozac.
Yeah, it's a little healthier. Although it's time-consuming reading Smith. This is not a book you can press on your friends and say, you've got to read this book, because those first two parts are a little slow, and most of our friends may not get through it. But this part is, it's good reading.
He says then that, all this stuff has been associated with God and religion, and that religion has very much been an inculcator of these things. And he gives an example of one bishop or cleric, I forget what he was.
That's great.
And that it's
a little hard passage to follow, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, and that it's a little bit taking things too far, and that religion often does this. Established religion often does this, and then people react against these generalizations, these sort of, over sentimentalizing, this kind of preachiness, and then they reject religion. And but he warns against that, or he warns against rejecting whatever the spiritual substances here. He says, we can wonder that so strange an application
can we wonder?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. Can we wonder that so strange an application, that's this cleric's strange application. Can we wonder that so strange an application of this most respectable doctrine should sometimes have exposed it to contempt and derision, with those at least who had themselves, perhaps, no great taste or turn for the devout and contemplative virtues.
Yeah.
So it's like, people too often throw the baby out with the bathwater when they don't like the sort of religious bathwater, as it were. So moving on to chapter 3 of the influence and authority of conscience. The influence and authority of this principle is upon all occasions very great, and it is only by consulting this judge within that we can ever see what relates to ourselves and in its proper shape and dimensions, or that we can ever make any proper comparison between our own interests and those of others. Okay, he's got this analogy with vision and depth perception.
It's really
what
creative.
Seems like when he looks out his window, some things that are really very large just seem very small and insignificant, and he seems so large, things around him seem so large, and this is the kind of, just as we learn depth perception, we learn sort of moral depth perception, that things that seem so large to us aren't really large. And this leads into the earthquake in China.
Yeah.
Russ, do you want to pick up on that?
And this is a very famous example. I was one of the interesting things about going back and reading the book in its entirety as someone who only had dipped into it or has heard about it mostly from other people. This is one of the famous examples that you will hear about from the theory of moral sentiments. And I have to say, every time I'd heard of it, it turns out I had heard about it incorrectly from what Smith actually intended. So I'm going to read the passage for those following along at home. And
it's a long passage.
It's a long passage, but I'll try to read it in as lively a way as I can. And it's extremely Smith's conclusion is very different than what I had expected, especially if you're only a reader of The Wealth of Nations. So here's what he says. Let us suppose that the great empire of China, with all its myriads of inhabitants, was suddenly swallowed up by an earthquake, and let us consider how a man of humanity in Europe, who had no sort of connection with that part of the world, would be affected upon receiving intelligence of this dreadful calamity. He would, I imagine, first of all express very strongly his sorrow for the misfortune of that unhappy people. He would make many melancholy reflections upon the precariousness of human life and the vanity of all the labors of man, which could thus be annihilated in a moment. He would too, perhaps, if he was a man of speculation, enter into many reasonings concerning the effects which this disaster might produce upon the commerce of Europe and the trade and business of the world in general. And when all this fine philosophy was over, when all these humane sentiments had been once fairly expressed, he would pursue his business or his pleasure, take his repose or his diversion, with the same ease and tranquillity as if no such accident had happened. The most frivolous disaster which could befall himself would occasion a more real disturbance. If he was to lose his little finger tomorrow, he would not sleep tonight. But provided he never saw them, he would snore with the most profound security over the ruin of 100 million of his brethren. And the destruction of that immense multitude seems plainly an object less interesting to him than this paltry misfortune of his own. Now, I'm going to stop there for a second.
Sure.
And at that point, it basically says, look, here's the reality of life. Things that happen to other people don't bother us as much as things that happen to us. We're fundamentally selfish. Of course, losing a finger is quite a macabre and dark example. It's an 18th century example. It's not something most of us. I don't know many people who lost a finger. So what he's simply saying is that hey, we're self-centered, and that's very consistent, I think, with the parody of Smith that's in popular culture. Smith's all about selfishness, greed, etc.
And all that fine talk is just kind of.
It's empty.
Cheap talk.
Right, exactly. Caring about these people and all, right. And the way he worded it, he clearly is saying it's not as heartfelt as it might otherwise.
Before you go on, though, one thing I want to remark about that first, about half of the paragraph, is how he speaks of the 100 millions of his brethren.
Yeah, nice.
I think that's extremely significant.
Yeah.
I'm sure that I would imagine that struck, English readers in the 18th century. The Chinese are my brethren. Oh, I guess in a way they are. I mean, I think that was something. Yeah,
and he chose China because in the 18th century and even today, it's an alien place. It's foreign to us. It's far away physically, and its world is not our world.
Go on.
Okay, so he then says, so he's invoked this contrast between how a person feels about losing his finger versus 100 million people dying. He continues, to prevent, therefore, this paltry misfortune to himself, would a man of humanity be willing to sacrifice the lives of 100 million of his brethren, provided he had never seen them? Human nature startles with horror at the thought, and the world, in its greatest depravity and corruption, never produced such a villain as could be capable of entertaining it. But what makes this difference? And here Smith's asking, so how could it be that you sleep soundly knowing that tomorrow 100 million people are going to die, but you can't sleep if you're going to lose your little finger tomorrow, and yet you would not kill 100 million people to save your finger? There's a certain contradiction there. And his answer, well, let me reread the sentence. But what makes this difference when our passive feelings are almost always so sordid and so selfish? How come it that our active principles should often be so generous and so noble, when we are always so much more deeply affected by whatever concerns ourselves than by whatever concerns other men? What is it which prompts the generous upon all occasions and the mean upon many to sacrifice their own interest to the greater interests of others? It is not the soft power of humanity. It is not that feeble spark of benevolence which nature has lighted up in the human heart that is thus capable of counteracting the strongest impulses of self-love. It is a stronger power, a more forcible motive which exerts itself upon such occasions. It is reason, principle, conscience, the inhabitant of the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. It is he who, whenever we are about to act so as to affect the happiness of others, calls to us, with a voice capable of astonishing the most presumptuous of our passions, that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it, and that when we prefer ourselves so shamefully and so blindly to others, we become the proper objects of resentment, abhorrence, and execration. It is from him only that we learn the real littleness of ourselves and of whatever relates to ourselves, and the natural misrepresentations of self-love can be corrected only by the eye of this impartial spectator. It is he who shows us the propriety of generosity and the deformity of injustice, the propriety of resigning the greatest interests of our own for the yet greater interests of others, and the deformity of doing the smallest injury to another in order to obtain the greatest benefit to ourselves. And here he's going to conclude this paragraph with which I think is it's eloquent, it's beautiful, it's an incredible passage. But here he's going to conclude with an incredible parallel to a famous passage in The Wealth of Nations, that it's not from the benevolence of the butcher and our other tradespeople we deal with that we get our bread, but rather from their own self-interest. And he sort of turns it on his head here. He says, it is not the love of our neighbor, it is not the love of mankind which upon many occasions prompts us to the practice of those divine virtues. It is a stronger love, more powerful affection, which generally takes place upon such occasions, the love of what is honorable and noble, of the grandeur and dignity and superiority of our own characters. It's absolutely magnificent, right? He's saying that what motivates us to do good deeds and to put ourselves to the side and to forego the opportunity to hurt other people and advance our own self-interest, what stops that isn't that we care so much about other people, that we're truly altruistic. It's that it's a weird form of self-interest. It's we would not respect ourselves. There's something universal, as you said it before. There's something absolute about good, the good and the just and the right that comes from within us, that motivates us to do the right thing. It's an extraordinary. I love it. It's not the feeble spark of benevolence. We have some benevolence, but it's feeble. It's not enough most of the time to get us to stop from pursuing our self-interest if it means harming others. But rather, we have this deep moral code within us that's produced by the feeling of the impartial spectator, the man within, created by those judgments of others.
Yeah, there's a number of things in here I wanted to remark on, and I guess I'll start.
Go ahead. I'll
start there.
Editorializing along.
One way to take this is to kind of say that benevolence, beneficence, virtue resides in what one makes their self-interest.
Yeah, beautifully said.
So it's not, whether someone acts in their self-interest or not in their self-interest. It's what does one make into their self-interest.
We can create our own utility functions, to put it into modern economic language, right? We can decide what we get our pleasure from. We can get our pleasure from doing the right thing.
Right. And again, this creates spirals. I mean, it's we're now sort of judging what one has created, has made their self-interest, in a sense made their routines, their character, their identity. And even that can become routine, right, and too confined when it is then not awake to the next step. Someone he seems selfish. He should care more about his family. So then he learns to care more about his family. He gets into a groove of caring about his family. It's like, all that guy cares about is his family. He should care about the community. Look, when he makes a trade-off between the community and his family, he just cares about his family. It's like, you know what I mean? You can always kind of go, and that's that universal going wider and wider. And in a sense, Smith is challenging us to look for our own distinction inside ourselves in this wisdom of being wider and wider. And then we take a secret pleasure in, as he says in the very last line, what is honorable and noble, of the grandeur and dignity and superiority of our own characters. So he's got a love of distinction. He's trying to turn that towards wisdom. You know what I mean? Maybe you'd say that just he's noticing that virtue and morality uses that for wisdom and for good. But he's not trying to, he's reconciling the love of distinction and the pursuit of wisdom and virtue in a really interesting way, in a kind of non-sorted way where if it ever got sorted, you wouldn't have distinguished yourself as well as you otherwise would have. Because that sordidness would be part of the judgment of just how superior you are. Does that make sense?
Are you saying sordid S-O-R-T-E-D or sorted S-O-R-D-I-D?
D-I-D.
Okay, say it again.
Like this love of distinction gets channeled in a way where any sordidness that would come out of it is self-repressing in a way, because such sordidness is precisely what would keep you from feeling more superior in this way. So in a sense, he's like turning the pursuit of wisdom into the kind of distinction contest that he's urging us to play. Does that make sense?
I'm just puzzled why I use the word wisdom rather than goodness.
Well, it's the same difference, whatever. Yeah. Well, sure, wisdom, goodness, that's fine. Platonic justice, to go back to the original justices, that's the encompassing justice. Now, one thing that's curious about that is that he's talking about how, in some sense, we're moved to do this because we want this sense of grandeur, dignity, and superiority. And yet the impartial spectator is calling to us that we are but one of the multitude, in no respect better than any other in it. So how do you square finding superiority in answering the call of someone who insists that you're one of the multitude, not superior to anyone else in it? And that's not something I'm going to attempt to offer a resolution to.
I wrote somewhere else in here about a different passage, but I won't pull it out. But there's a Jewish expression, an exhortation that a person should have in his pocket a piece of paper that says, "From dust I was created, and to dust I shall return. I'm nothing. I'm a speck in the universe of God." And in the other pocket should be a piece of paper that says, "The universe was created for me. I have expectations of what I'm to achieve, and everything turns on that. My correct behavior, my dignity, my actions." And how can you can't reconcile those? And one, it says you're nothing, and the other, it says you're just little lower than the angels. And I think the right answer is you got to have both. If you just have one, if you just pursue distinction, you're going to be a monster. If you're so humble that you think you're a nothing and you're a nobody, you may as well kill yourself. And so a human being has to go through life with that tension. And I think Smith's saying something similar. You've got to have pride, but not too much pride, because you really are no better than anyone else. So strive to be, but remember that you're a human being and you have brethren.
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of like a happy middle. Don't go.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a happy middle.
Okay.
It's not a happy middle in that you're not going to take the mean. You've got to live with both of those at the same time. There's this inherent
invoking each at the right moment.
No, not necessarily. Invoking them both sort of simultaneously.
Okay.
It's like saying, I don't know.
Let me just, I don't want to leave this, but I want to just maybe enlarge, because in Smith, this is something I've been meaning to work in, is that in Smith, there is this curious tension, duality, I'm not quite sure what the word is, where in some respects, he speaks of the mob of humankind. He speaks of the present depraved state of mankind. He speaks of so weak and imperfect a creature as man. He speaks of men as coarse clay, out of which, and so in one way you get this feeling that he doesn't really think much of the average person, and with that he also does sometimes speak about the rareness of wisdom and the exceptionalness and a kind of aristocracy of judgment. So you've got, in one way, a very kind of distinction type sense within Smith. But on the other hand, you've got very much this kind of any stranger can pull you towards universal wisdom. Any stranger can change your perspective. Everyone's got the same basic moral faculties, same kind of moral problems. No one's really better than each other. Just like the porter and the philosopher in The Wealth of Nations, they really just happen to have had different circumstances that created different results. And so on the one hand, you get a very, sort of egalitarian, everyone's of equal worth kind of view. And on the other hand, you get a sense of superiority. So
most people are scum. Is the darker view, and that's reality.
Yeah, I wouldn't think he would ever put it that way, but
of course, clay and weak and base.
Well,
what do you got?
Well, scum nowadays has a connotation of more sort of like bad and. But he does say depraved. Yeah, he does say so weak. It's a present depraved state of mankind.
I think I think your earlier point is very relevant here. One way to view that seeming contradiction or duality is it's exhortation. Look, we're human beings. The man within often lies to to us and says we're doing the right thing. Our conscience often fools us into. We've had a lot of conversations on EconTalk about the philosophy of pragmatism and the flaws of reason and rationality and in their conversations with Taleb and elsewhere, that it's very hard to do the right thing. And I think Smith would admit it because we're coarse clay and we're weak and depraved and we're fallible, and he talks about self-deception. But we can rise above that, right? And he's exhorting us. This is what goodness is. This is what we should strive for. Whether we all strive for it, no, that'd be a lie. Maybe even most people don't strive for it because we're all human. But I think he's outlining what the world can be, and part of it is some of his world was like that as well. But I think there's a beautiful simultaneous embracing of those. It's a very rich view of what life's about.
I don't have a resolution. I'm still working on that.
But we're all that. We're all that. In fact, we're that.
I would like to somehow kind of work out the superiority in the egalitarianism. It's kind of so that I'd like to somehow reconcile them. But anyhow,
okay,
I don't have a resolution to offer. So
I view it as a very rich picture of humanity. That
at any one moment, absolutely. But at any
one moment, we can rise above our coarse clay, and other times we sink into it, and we are who we are. Yeah. It's a very I find it very moving.
I actually consider liberalism, in some sense, to be this whole philosophy. See, that's my religion. You have your religion, and my religion essentially is liberalism. I don't believe in liberalism as a religion in the sense of or a creator, obviously, or of an afterlife and all that. I'm quite a naturalist on all those matters. And where did all this come from? I have no idea. I don't even know what that means, really, to ask, to tell you the truth. But in terms of the surrogate nature, the kind of secular, it's like liberalism is like my religion. And in some ways, I think I kind of tend to read Smith, actually, as, building. He's kind of the Jesus of liberalism, I guess.
Or Moses, in my case.
Or Moses, perhaps, yeah.
For those of you listening to this, maybe to Dan for the first time, when Dan says liberalism, he means it in the classical sense, the enterprise of liberty.
Yeah. There's one other point in this paragraph that, he says, when our passive feelings are almost always so sordid and so selfish, how comes it that our active principles should often be so generous and so noble? Again, a big theme for me of this book is that it can be read as having a deep, rich, underlying political message about degovernmentalizing, depoliticizing society. He's saying that it's in our active faculties that we are best. That suggests that schooling and welfare and jobs and taking care of your life, your retirement, your family, and everything else should be more an active matter of your own choice, as opposed to something that basically has sort of been decided for you from above, either by being taxed, regulated, put into a government school, and so on and so forth, where everything becomes much more passive for you. In a more governmentalized, more politicized society. That's only one aspect of, I think, those themes. But this notion that we are more virtuous the more active we are, and the more active we need to be, I think has that. I kind of take in a somewhat libertarian way, actually.
It's interesting. Very interesting.
He goes on after that, and he talks about two sets of philosophers who have kind of talked about this moral duty, a sense of duty. And the first of the moralists, the whining and melancholy moralists.
This is a spectacular indictment of do-goodism.
Do-goodism. And these are the types who say, love your neighbor as much as yourself, right? And they seem altogether absurd and unreasonable. They bear a certain affective and sentimental sadness for things when they happen, like an earthquake in China. It's not really all to any good purpose. And Smith says that we don't really need to expend a lot of emotional energy on those whom we can neither serve nor hurt.
He's very much a pragmatist, and he's at that point, and he's also he's not big on being guilty about being prosperous or happy or successful or even lucky.
Stuff you don't really...
Because there's nothing in his mind, whether in our world's different, but in his mind, since you can't redress these imbalances or even injustices, you should just be serene and go on. It's a very...
and he tends to
unmodern view.
Tends to put these whining and melancholy moralists to the side pretty quickly. Again, Smith resorts to the view that we should really only care about those whom we can serve or hurt. But I do think that there's something to be said for these whining and melancholy moralists, because whom we can and can't serve and hurt, right, is not something we necessarily always have a great sense of. And to some extent, they might be alerting us, right, informing us that, actually you could give to this charity, right? Or you could, buy this kind of meat such that cows aren't raised in such a terrible way, kind of a Peter Singer. I mean, he's kind of a whining and melancholy moralist, right?
Yeah.
But in some ways, I respect the guy because he's raising these issues that maybe we can be more have greater connection to these people we treat as like, well, I don't devote any, moral energy on that because I'm not connected to it. It's of no purpose. Well, he's saying, well, it could be of a purpose. You could get involved.
No, I think our disputes in general, if we stay away from the animal rights issue, which I think is clear that we're hurting cows when we eat them.
But there's different ways they can be raised and all that.
Correct. So I'm agreeing with you there. I think the more interesting case is, say, a trade issue where what are they called? Whining and
melancholy moralists.
The whining and melancholy moralists are telling us we shouldn't buy sneakers made by poor people in Asia.
They just get it wrong.
Right. Well, that's my point. Is that because of the unknowability? You're saying that because of the unknowability, the whining moralists might be doing us a favor. They might be alerting us to the possibility that our actions might affect others. I'm pointing out that the unknowability often means that what you think is hurting them might be better than the alternative, and to pretend that there's a perfect world out there is a mistake.
But I gather that Peter Singer, in his latest book, I saw the Blogging Heads with Peter Singer and Tyler Cowen, and he's saying give to charity. He's saying you can give more to charity and you would help people a lot in Africa or wherever. And, Smith says it only really matters for whom we can serve or hurt. Well, who can we serve or hurt?
Well, that's the question.
Right? And that's the question that's being raised. So those are the ones who tell us to love our neighbor as much as ourselves. And then there are the other set of philosophers who he also seems to think overdo it, who say love yourself only as much as your neighbor. And that's the Stoics. And basically he seems to pretty much dig the Stoics.
Dig meaning like?
Yeah, dig meaning like.
Well, he invoked that argument earlier in part 2, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
That there's something virtuous about tempering your self-love.
That's right. He does think that it can be overdone. He speaks, for example, about the affection between parent and child. By the way, he has an evolutionary remark here about the continuous and propagation of the species depending altogether upon the affection of the parent to the child, but not the child to the parent. And he notices that while he points out the asymmetry, which is an evolutionary moment. There's another one.
It's a great passage because he points out, as many have noticed, that in the Ten Commandments it says you should honor your parents. He says but he says it doesn't tell you to love your children, and the standard answer would be because you don't have to command people to that, but you do have to command them to honor your parents.
That's right.
But he neglects the fact that it doesn't say to love your parents, because the God of
Can you command love, though?
Yeah, because you can't command love, but honor is a standard you can at least aspire to.
I'll try to skip over this, but basically he says that the Stoics can overdo it. Like, he thinks that if a Stoic son died, right, the Stoic may not show much
Emotion,
of grief, whatever, and I think Smith is saying that that's actually a little bit off-putting.
Yeah.
Like for somebody to seem so insensible to things like that it might even be improper.
Yeah.
To be so stoical in some ways. However,
although he praises stoicism with a small s throughout, there's an unbelievable passage
when it comes to like not losing your son, but losing your arm,
losing your leg from a cannonball in war, you're supposed to then quietly tell.
That's right.
Keep commanding the officers and show no emotion.
That's right. In private misfortunes, where it's not kind of when it's more just strictly private and selfish, then he's like all for stoicism, basically. Yeah. He talks about he talks here a little bit about how we sense another viewpoint as soon as we're in the company of other people. He says this effect is produced instantaneously and, as it were, mechanically. Again, this notion. I think that Smith sees the spectatorial thing as very instinctual and subconscious.
It's built into the fabric of the universe for him. There's no doubt about it.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure what the thread here is in my notes, but I'm just going to go on. The man of, let's see, impartial spectator. Okay, so he says that we learn to judge and review not only our outward conduct, but even our inward sentiments, okay, which would include our moral sentiments. So again, that's one of these moments which I see as one of these kind of dialectical moments, if you will, where it's kind of like the next step. The dividing of the dividing, the next layer. Because if you're going to judge your sentiments, including your moral sentiments, you're kind of creating a judge of a judge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great point.
So that whole iteration, that recursivity is maybe the best word, I think is crucial because it's in the continual motion, I think, that Smith really sees virtue. He doesn't want people simply to figure out what is virtuous and then go kind of plow their trade in virtue mindlessly and in a routine. He wants people to always be kind of seeing the next layer in this kind of more universal, right?
Self-improvement.
Yeah.
That it's a journey.
And service of sort.
Yeah.
Duty, a sense of duty, as he puts it.
And here, I think, if you're talking about the passage I'm thinking of, is he's trying to try to create a theory of self-control.
Oh, yes.
And the ability to restrain oneself. I kept thinking in these passages of sort of the classic view of the English gentleman and Kipling's poem If, which is a sort of theory of moral sentiments. It's Kipling's laying out what he thinks virtuous and noble about being a human, and it's very much in line with Smith. So a lot of it is about self-restraint, not getting overly involved in whatever it is.
He's got a little bit of self-command here, and more comes later in the book. Okay, we're coming up here to the guy with the wooden leg. He soon identifies himself with the ideal man, within the breast. He soon becomes the impartial spectator of his own situation. So over time, if a situation really persists, you gradually come more to that view. I think that's a very interesting, in a way, and he's got other things in here. He says, in the end, time, the great and universal comforter, gradually composes the weak man to the same degree of tranquility which a regard to his own dignity and manhood teaches the wise man to assume in the beginning. Okay? So it kind of suggests that we're all on the same path of moral learning. Not necessarily the same path, but sort of we all have, again, the same source, emanator. So there's some convergence in our different moral learnings. And the idea that we all come to it over time reminds me actually of Kerzner on entrepreneurship, where we tend to notice what is in our interest to notice. Where over time, in your habitat, you'll notice, oh, there's this that I could use for that, and there's this, like Robinson Crusoe on his island will notice that, oh, I could actually make a net out of this, and even though there's even no information, he just kind of thinks differently about it, and he comes to these better views about it. So people tend to notice what it is in their interest to notice. And so this, if you create a parallel here to Kerzner, it's like kind of implying that people have an interest to come to the more impartial view of their life. Okay? If that's
a very interesting idea.
Anyhow, the man who struggles the least, this is when someone has loss of a leg, a child, or something terrible. The man who struggles the least, who most easily and readily acquiesces in the fortune which has fallen to him, very soon recovers his usual and natural tranquility. Okay, I don't know if you remember this.
For a man with 2 legs, I don't know did Smith have children?
No.
So it's a rather, there's a little bit of hubris there that I'm not sure is true.
Yeah.
That to suggest that people who've gone through a horrific tragedy, the loss of a child or the loss of a limb, that they're soon restored to their former tranquility is a huge leap of empirical faith.
Did you say soon?
No, eventually. I should have said, sorry.
Eventually.
Yeah. Well, soon enough.
That's
soon
true,
enough. Eventually. I don't know.
Yeah. I think there's probably some counter evidence.
Yeah.
Around. Okay. Now, he talks some about the man who shows both the amiable and the respectable virtues. Remember those 2 sets of virtues? Sort of 2 different sides of the spiral. Amiable are ones that are more compassionate, more empathetic, entering into the other's problems and feelings, whereas the respectable is kind of containing your own and imposing on others less your own when you're sort of the person principally affected. And he says that the person who joins both of these most surely is the natural and proper object of our highest love and admiration. So it's definitely like both sides of the complete person kind of thing. And he goes on to say that the 2 in some ways go together because being amiable, being compassionate, being thoughtful and humane, in some ways, when properly done, involve actually self-sacrifice, where you have to repress your own pressing concerns and needs to enter into those. And so there's a side that's actually being respectable in doing that, or at least the ability to self-command, right, to step out of your own little problems and world so that you can be humane and give is those things are complements, he's saying, and that without each other, each can be sort of overdone and hardened, it would seem. Like humanity can just be excessive, too much grieving, too much commiserating, right? And being all stiff and proper and dry can actually be improper because you're not making yourself interesting to others. You're not letting them into your life. You're not, letting their lives be enriched by you in a way. So it's a kind of give and take, back and forth kind of thing. What else have we got here? He's got different lifestyles, cultivate different characters and types of people. First of all, he says in solitude, we tend to brood on ourselves and think too much of our own problems and stuff. And that's why we need to go out into the world. He says conversation of a friend brings us to a better temper, and that of a stranger to a still better temper. Yeah. Because a friend might indulge our brooding, whereas a stranger won't, and in a way that lifts us better out of the brooding, which again I think is a kind of interesting thing, goes back to a kind of kind of universal humanity that by actually connecting with a stranger, You get a wider perspective. You're a small part of the universe,
That's a really deep. That's a very deep thing, especially when you think about travel, and we think of travel as a relatively self-indulgent experience. But if you think of travel as an opportunity to interact with people who aren't like you, who can't share your personal dreams and failures and problems, inevitably you've got to interact with them in a different way. And you see this sometimes it's a kind of gruesome, but in a very small way. Someone's you're having a fight, you're yelling with someone, and then the phone rings, and you pick it up, and you immediately assume a normal tone of voice. You could be having this huge argument with your kids, and all of a sudden the phone rings, hello, and you're thinking, wait a minute, where was that civil, pleasant person 1 nanosecond ago?
Right.
How'd you turn that side of you off so easily? And you should do it more often, right? A lot of times you find yourself in a situation where you realize, wait a minute, this isn't me. But sometimes it's hard to stop that, and that stranger turns that side off instantly. It's a very interesting point.
Yeah, and he's saying that the other person, the actual person, stranger, friend, often awakens your internal man in the breast. Okay, he says, the man within the breast, the abstract and ideal spectator of our sentiments and conduct. And by the way, where he says ideal there, I propose that means in idea, like not real, like not actual, not ideal in the sense of ultimate, God.
No. Well, for sure, it's not. But I took it in the sense of meaning the way this is the man in the breast you really should have. This is the desirable man in the breast, the ideal one, the best, the one you should have. It's a normative man in the breast, not a positive man in the breast. That's the way I took it.
Oh, yeah. It could be that, too. Yes. The would-be spectator, the would-be better spectator, requires often to be awakened and put in mind of his duty. Okay, you could put it that way. But that's a good reading.
The sleeping spectator.
That's right.
Wake him up and say, come on.
The sleeping better spectator.
You got to wake him up, get him involved to judge you.
Yeah, by the presence of the real spectator. That's the phone call.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. He says it right here. So, but notice that he's saying that the man in the breast has to be put in mind of his duty. So his duty to whom? So he's got to have someone else he's reporting to, right?
That's the onion or whatever.
And ultimately going back to something universalist, I think, in principle anyway. Yep. So the conscience itself has a duty. Strangers teach impartiality, as we've said. He issues a couple of imperatives. When you're down, go into the world. These are my words. When you're up, go to those independent of you. When you're up, things are going well for you. You feel big, right?
Big shot, yeah.
You're big shot. Go to people who are independent of you, who don't care.
And aren't going to suck up to you and
exactly.
praise you and tell you how great you are.
Exactly. And he just puts those right, just in imperatives. I mean, they are just imperative sentences.
He's got there's more advice in this section than there is previously.
Mm-hmm. He starts getting into war, like places where the awareness is lost, and he starts talking about war negotiation. The laws of justice are very seldom observed there. A man who is in private transaction would be beloved and most esteemed. In public transactions is laughed at as a fool and an idiot. So in other words, ordinary sort of wholesome organic virtues are almost spurned in public transactions. Okay, again, I see this as a kind of anti-governmentalization theme. In the most unjust war, it is commonly the sovereign or the ruler who are guilty. This is another point. The subjects are almost always perfectly innocent, and yet subjects are often punished as though they were guilty. And this is out of a kind of nationalism. He's got some anti-nationalism moments here as well. This is an injustice to punish subjects in the enemy nation that really were not in any way guilty of what the sovereign and the rulers had done, the government had done. And he starts talking about hostile factions. both rebels and heretics are those unlucky persons, the weaker party. So in other words, victors write the history, and they get often extremely punished by the victors and the powers. In a nation distracted by faction, few preserve their judgment untainted by the general contagion. Do you remember that one, Russ? Faction in society. And he says, in a nation distracted by faction, I mean, think about our so-called liberal versus conservative struggle, which I think is just ridiculous contagion of groupthink. A nation distracted by faction, few preserve their judgment untainted by the general contagion.
Yeah.
I love that.
Beautiful.
It's kind of like this political culture or factional culture is cultural pollution, contagion. More along these lines, a true party man hates and despises candor, and in reality there is no vice which could so effectually disqualify him for the trade of a party man as that single virtue. So in other words, candor is selected out of
read
politics.
The next sentence.
I'm sorry, just reading off my notes here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
He says, the real, revered and impartial spectator, therefore, is upon no occasion at a greater distance than amidst the violence and rage of contending parties. He's saying it's essentially an amoral activity. There's no
right.
The spectator's been pushed off into the distance in the name of partisanship. To them, it may be said that such a spectator scarce exists anywhere in the universe. Even to the great judge of the universe, meaning God, they impute all their own prejudices. They invoke God for their self-interest. He says, even to the great judge of the universe, they impute all their own prejudices and often view that divine being as animated by all their own vindictive and implacable passions. Of all the corrupters of moral sentiments, therefore, faction and fanaticism have always been by far the greatest. So to me, that was Smith's view of political maneuvering and the political marketplace as being essentially destructive.
If people were to listen to this and say, who you two guys kidding? You're the strongest ideologues, in the potosphere or whatever. It's like, well, the point, we're ideological, maybe we're factional in that sense, but the point is we want a government, we want a society where it's not a matter of factions, right? If schooling, like churches, were degovernmentalized, it wouldn't be. I guess churches in a way are factional. I mean, that's not a great example, but
I think it is a good example.
Okay.
It's not just faction. Doesn't mean distinctives. He means going to battle to get other people to do what you're doing,
right?
And
fighting
to join
over the ring of power.
Yeah, and so to me, it's the issue of creationism versus evolution in the schools.
Exactly.
Why should that be a political issue? Go to the school where you want your kids to learn whatever it is. And nobody sits around and
right.
Anyway,
there's no Republican bundle of groceries and Democrat bundle of groceries at Safeway.
Yeah, just buy what you like.
Yeah, and so the more that we would see,
and respect what your neighbor buys. Don't go look at your neighbor's cart and say, "I don't like that that you're studying blah 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 for your kids." I want to decide what your kids study. Why should that be in the collective decision? Right. It's bizarre.
Right. So we may be passionate in our political views, but we're not
factionalizing.
But we're for an anti-factional society, actually.
Well, I think we'll stop here. We were going to do parts 3, 4, and 5, Dan, but we got up to part 3, chapter 3. So on the next podcast, we'll pick up where we left off, which will be part 3, chapters 4 and 5, and we'll see how far we go from there. I want to thank you, Dan, for again being our guide to the Theory of Moral Sentiments by Adam Smith.
I want to thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.